Luke Thomas here on a Wednesday with some breaking news, so let's get to it. UFC, and really TKO, the parent group, but let's just say UFC and the plaintiffs, a group of fighters in a class action lawsuit, have settled. Yes, they were set to go to trial April 15th, the Monday following UFC 300. In a jury trial, they were set to move forward. Everything was heading in that direction, but the parties have in fact settled. What did they settle for? You'll be surprised to hear this, potentially $335 million. And from what we know, no contract changes, although I suppose that could change depending on how things go, but $335 million to be dispersed over a period of time that the parties agreed to. The lawyers are going to take a hefty amount. I've seen some estimates at around 30%. And by the way, this doesn't just cover the first trial, or first case, I should say. It covers both cases. So this means that the UFC is done with all antitrust problems, not just now, but for the foreseeable future. So let's unpack what all of this means. All right, so first things first, $335 million, how much is that? Now, the plaintiffs were initially asking for up to $800 million to $1.5 billion, which could have been tripled if they had won in court, which could have been $4.5 billion, which, by the way, even that wouldn't necessarily have been all that problematic for the UFC, but okay, it got put down to $335 million. Why they settled on that amount, we don't know. In the next 45 to 60 days, both parties will submit documents to the court. Now, this is the last kind of thing that could hold it up. The court has to approve this settlement. Just because the two parties agreed doesn't mean the court will. I don't know what the likelihood is that they'll disapprove it. In fact, I think it's probably exceedingly low. But nevertheless, that does have to happen. And when we get those documents, we'll have more of an understanding about what happens. If you actually look at the math on this, if the lawyers end up taking somewhere between 20 to 30%, and there are roughly 1,200 fighters who could have gotten money, it ends up, and some will get more than others, but it averages out to about $280,000 per fighter, minus 30% all the way around. So not a lot of money for the fighters in this particular case relative to A, what they could have gotten, or B, what they were even asking for. However, the response to that could have been if they had gone to jury trial, they could have gotten absolutely nothing. And so settlements like this tend to happen more often than not when there is a lot to potentially lose for either party. Both parties kind of come to a settlement, obviously in this particular case, but come to an arrangement where they realize I could walk out of here with absolutely nothing or some kind of devastating consequence. What's something of a middle ground that we could get to? But here is the key. There were two antitrust cases. One was going to go to trial April 15th, and another one our case was set to continue moving forward after that. And they are basically making the same claims, but they cover two different periods of time. There was the Kung Lee case and then the Cajun Johnson case. They just same claims, but just different points in time. As I mentioned, they settled both. But the key here is, in the Lee case, they were only asking for damages. In the Johnson case, they were asking for damages as well as injunctive relief. And that could have been any change to a UFC contract where it could have shortened them to, let's say, a year or two max. And then they would have had to just operate as such under those terms. That's not in play anymore. It's gone. And there's not going to be many damages from the Johnson case because you'll recall, if you sign with the UFC now, you have to sign away your right in order to, or not right, I should say, you have to sign away the opportunity to join any future class action lawsuit. So the damages on that side are not much. They're only in the Lee case. The potential weight of what they could have done with the injunctive relief in the Johnson case, that is gone. So that's it. $335 million. Folks, let's just break this down very clearly and state it as matter-of-factly as we can. If there is no union that's established, or there is no Ali Act that gets ends up getting extended to MMA from boxing, fighter pay is just going to be what it's going to be for the foreseeable future, period. That's it. And you might ask, what's the likelihood of a union? Well, we saw Project Spearhead fail. We saw many attempts at unionization fail. It will just go away. And I don't think there's any really effort to get one going again. Never say never, but it doesn't seem even remotely likely anytime soon. On the other side, what's the likelihood of getting the Ali Act extended? Well, formerly Representative Mark Wayne Mullen of Oklahoma, who was a congressman, he was a former former MMA fighter, not UFC. He had introduced legislation and had it shepherded through Congress previously, but that legislation was essentially just died on the vine. It never made it out to the floor for a vote. And he hasn't reintroduced it now that he's become a senator. So there is no Ali Act being extended to MMA, even currently being discussed or put through committee or anything. It just doesn't exist. And so the UFC fighters are going to get a very modest amount, I think, in the end. I mean, there might be some different interpretations over time, depending on what we discover, again, in the next 45 to 60 days when both sides submit the documentation and we can see exactly what payouts kind of look like and on what schedule. And again, there might be something else that we don't really know as of yet. But if you just read the UFC statement on this, and I'll put up a graphic of it below, they don't seem to think that there's anything more to it than this. They seem very pleased with the outcome, as you might well imagine. And so we're just sort of asking at this point, how do the fighters feel? We don't know. We have not got a sense, the opportunity to talk to them yet. We haven't really heard from the plaintiffs and what they have to say and why they feel like this was an adequate offer or why this particular sum was the one that everyone agreed to. Again, there's just a lot of unknowns in this particular case, but that's how it goes. I will also say, if you're the PFL or ONE, this is really, 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 really bad news. Very, very bad news for those organizations. Again, I'm going to say it one more time. Without regulatory intervention in a very, relatively speaking, unregulated space that is mixed martial arts, it is not possible to compete with the UFC. They have reached monopoly status times a billion. They cannot be touched. It's not possible to compete with them. And so, as a consequence, if without this kind of intervention, and again, not much likelihood of unionization. By the way, unionization would entrench them as a monopoly in a legal way, I should say more of a formal way. But putting that to the side, Ali Act would make it much more likelihood for someone else to be able to compete. But that's not even remotely on the horizon, or potentially ever going to be something that we can talk about. And so, if you're the PFL, if you're ONE, this is grim news. The long-term prognosis for them is bad. How long they will last is hard to say. They could generate revenue or raise capital potentially in any number of different ways. People have noted they have a relationship with Saudi Arabia, and that could prove fruitful. We'll see. But you have to realize is the UFC also has a relationship with some of these kingmakers, these financial kingmakers as well, in particular Saudi Arabia, as well as the Emirates, and who knows where else that could extend. So it's not this idea that like that's some kind of saving grace for them. It's not possible. Folks, I've said this before, I'll say it again. The way fight sports works is that there is a group of people that at any given time, either in boxing or MMA, either the 1950s or 2024, doesn't matter, there is a group of folks that the general public sort of widely acknowledges to be the champions of note or the ones of significance. The only way for any other entity to compete with them is only if their fighters get a chance to fight those other aforementioned fighters that the public recognizes. The UFC does not co-promote. There is no legal mechanism to force them to co-promote. It doesn't exist. And therefore, without that opportunity for crossover, it just won't happen. Guys, I have seen it. I have seen the IFL and Elite XC. I have seen the WECs and the Strike Forces and the Bellators. You cannot create a separate league that doesn't have meaningful overlap with competition schedule with the UFC and expect to survive. It simply will not work. You will go out of business. It's just a function of when. I don't know when that's going to be for ONE. I don't know when that's going to be for PFL. But if nothing changes between now and whenever they run out of money, they will in fact run out of money. It will come to an end. It is not, listen to me very clearly, it is not possible to compete with them. It cannot be done. It will not be done. Again, if they introduce legislation or if there's some other kind of way in which there's regulatory intervention, it's a brand new ballgame. But up until that point, that's what it is. Last point on this is I just react to the news here with the minimal amount of information that we have. The last thing I would say on this is someone asked me, like, how do you cover fighter pay going forward? The answer is it will still matter on some level. You will still hear griping about it on some level. There are still some states that release fighter pay figures. We do know that. As well, you'll get some guys, it's a very small amount of guys, but you'll get some guys who eventually get out of their deals or find a way in some kind of capacity. Although remember, sunset clauses have been either dramatically downgraded or in a functional sense nearly eliminated. But someone might get a boxing fight in the future, and they're going to get a ridiculous, a ridiculous payday for it, and that will still be relevant to a lot of news cycles. I think in that case, yes, fighter pay will be relevant. But I have to tell you, I've never had a fighter ever say anything praiseworthy about media coverage, about how they're underpaid. I have heard them multiple times, not all of them, of course, everyone's individual, but I have heard many of them speak out about how they don't like fighter pay coverage and think that they're paid just fine. Well, congratulations. If you like the way you're paid, you're going to get a lot more of it. You're going to get a lot more of it. So congratulations to those folks. This is, on that level, a great day. But in terms of the editorial priority, fighter pay will still be relevant. And again, assuming the judge doesn't intervene here in some kind of way, but if everything just continues as it has based on the news today, and this agreement is supported by the judge, and then there is no Ali Act or anything else, I think that fighter pay as an editorial priority will take a massive hit. There'll be a lot less conversation about it. There will always be some, but relative to what it has been the last few years, I expect a significant and frankly kind of deserved decline. There's not as much mechanism to cover it. There are states that increasingly make it impossible to find out what it is. If the UFC goes private again, then, or I should say, Endeavor and TKO, if they go private, then obviously you'll have even less financial transparency. And again, they will be the top of the food chain, total monopoly, complete control of the industry. That will just be that. So for the fighters who got really mad at the media about trying to shine a light on what was, I think pretty clearly, substandard pay, great day for those folks. They're going to get exactly what they asked for. So I'm happy for them. All right. That's it for this update. If you got any questions, leave them in the comments below. We'll try to get to it on the chat tomorrow. But historic day, settlement in the antitrust lawsuit. Not one, but both. UFC wins again, I would say. We'll have to get more details to be fully declaring that, but a monumental day in the sport of mixed martial arts. I'm Luke Thomas. I'll see y'all later.